I've always believed land remembers. Every scar, every blessing, every storm, it all leaves a mark that you can feel if you know how to listen. My name is Ray Matheson, and I live on the same stretch of earth my father did and his father before him. 106 acres of rolling pasture, cedar woods, and good dark soil in the foothills outside Belridge, Georgia. But the most precious part of my land doesn't sprawl wide, it winds narrow. The creek. Sutter's Creek, as my grandfather called it, after the man who first mapped it in the 1800s, had run cold and clear for generations, feeding our irrigation lines, watering our cattle, and keeping the earth along its banks rich and alive. Even in the driest summers, you could kneel beside it and cup your hands into water that felt like it ran straight from heaven. I'd learned to skip stones there as a boy, taught my own daughter to catch crawdads there when she was 7, and I still walked its edge most mornings with my old mutt, Jasper. It was more than water, it was memory, and it was mine. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Thursday, early spring. The birds had started to come back, and the creek was babbling happily. I was down by the bend near the property line, with my thermos of coffee same as always, when I noticed the sound wasn't right. The water didn't sound like it was running, it sounded like it was fighting. I followed it upstream past the rusted-out gate, where the HOA's paved walking path came too close to our land for my liking, until I reached the spot that made my stomach clench. Someone had piled cinder blocks across part of the creek, haphazard, like a dam half-built by amateurs. The water was pooling on my side, and barely trickling on the other. "What the hell?" I muttered, stepping closer. That side of the property belonged to a woman named Karen Langford, newly elected HOA vice president. Platinum blonde hair, 2-size, 2-small yoga pants, and a designer water bottle always in hand. She'd moved in 3 years ago, bought the biggest house in the subdivision that hugged up against the eastern edge of my land, and had been a pain in my neck ever since. Karen didn't like the creek's unpredictable nature. That's what she'd said during a neighborhood meeting I accidentally attended last year. I only went because they were voting on a leash law, and Jasper, cranky old thing that he is, doesn't tolerate muzzles. At that meeting, Karen had floated the idea of stabilizing the creek path for public safety. It was all code HOA speak for, I want to make it look pretty for my backyard photos. But I didn't think she'd go this far. Not actually build something. Not actually alter the land. I pulled out my phone and took photos. The blocks weren't just dumped. There were rebar rods sticking out, and someone had poured a bit of concrete around the base. This was no accident. I walked back to the house, heat rising in my chest like a burn. It had been a quiet winter. I'd been focused on fencing the north pasture and finishing repairs on the roof. I hadn't paid attention to what she'd been up to over the hedgerow. That was a mistake. The next morning, I walked back to the creek before dawn with Jasper and found 2 men in neon vests working on the makeshift dam. One had a portable cement mixer. The other was leveling stones. "Hey," I barked, crossing the water. "You boys got a permit for this." They froze. The older one glanced at me like I was a nuisance. The younger one looked genuinely scared. "We're with the HOA," the older one said. "Ms. Langford requested erosion control for the shared waterway." "This ain't shared," I said. "That water's on my land, and what you're doing is illegal. You've altered the flow. You're backing it up on my side." They exchanged a look. The older guy shrugged. "Take it up with the board man. We're just hired help." They packed up and left. But the damage had already started. The water behind the blocks was rising faster than usual. And with spring rain coming, I knew that extra pressure could spell disaster. I tried to keep my calm that day, but by dusk, I'd driven over to the HOA office at the entrance to the neighborhood. It's one of those new developments, Silverwood Estates, with big iron signs and manicured hedges. The office was closed, but I slipped a typed letter under the door citing Georgia's water rights laws, photos attached, and a polite but firm request to remove the obstruction. That should have been enough. It would have been back when people respected boundaries. 3 days later, I got a reply in the mail. Certified envelope, HOA letterhead, signed by Karen Langford herself. "Dear Mr. Matheson, the HOA appreciates your concern. However, after review, we have determined that the waterway in question runs through the designated easement between our properties, which grants the HOA the authority to make improvements for erosion control and visual appeal in accordance with our Charter Section 9B. I stopped reading. Visual appeal. It wasn't just arrogance. It was war. I went back down to the creek and found even more concrete. The wall was higher now, the flow thinner, and on my side the water was turning into a murky pool. Jasper wouldn't even go near it. He growled low when we walked past it, as if the land itself had started to sour. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat up in the kitchen nursing whiskey and old regrets. I'd let my guard down. Thought this land was sacred enough that no one would dare touch it. But Karen had touched it, and something told me she wasn't done. Not yet. The next time I saw Karen Langford, she was wearing white yoga pants and a pink hoodie that said "Wifey" across the chest in sparkly rhinestones. She was standing at the edge of her lawn, supervising 3 workers in HOA polos who were dragging fresh bags of concrete mix down the slope toward the creek. I stood on my side of the property line, arms crossed, trying to hold back the fury boiling in my chest. "Karen," I called. She turned slowly like I was just some noise behind her. "Oh, Ray?" she said with that icy cheerfulness she reserved for people she'd decided were beneath her. "You got my letter?" "I did," I said. "And I'm going to ask you one more time to stop pouring concrete in the creek." She let out a short, dismissive laugh and started walking toward me, stopping just shy of the hedgerow that separated our lands. "It's not your creek, Ray. It's an easement. Look it up." "I did. You're wrong." "Well, the HOA disagrees." She adjusted her sunglasses, glancing over her shoulder like she had more important things to do than talk to the farmer next door. "Besides, we're improving the community. Do you know how many people have slipped back here during storms? On your lawn, maybe, not on my land." Her voice dipped an octave. "Ray, you don't want to fight the HOA. We've dealt with more stubborn residents than you. And let me tell you, when it comes to legal authority, you're not going to win." "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact," she said sweetly, then turned and walked away, waving a little too hard at her workers. "Make sure the footing goes another foot higher." I stood there for another minute, trying to steady my breathing. The air smelled of wet cement and fresh arrogance. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I pulled out the deed to my land and pored over every map and boundary line. The creek sat clearly within my property, no easement, no shared access, just mine. But this HOA, they operated like a private government. They wrote their own rules and enforced them with money and threat letters. I didn't have much faith in letters anymore, but I knew someone who did. Tom Rayner, my old army buddy, had gone to law school after we got out. He now worked as a private property rights attorney out in Athens. I called him the next morning. "Let me guess," he said when I told him. "HOA Karen." "Pretty much." "I swear they're like a cult," he muttered. "Send me photos. Send me your deed, your property plat, anything you've got." By noon, I'd sent him everything. By evening, he called me back. "You're right, Ray. That creek's entirely on your property. No easement, no shared access. They've got no legal right to touch it." "Then why are they getting away with it?" "Because no one stopped them." His words stuck in my chest like a nail. I didn't sleep that night either. The next morning, I was in my truck by 6:30 a.m. heading to the county permit office. I wanted to see if Karen or the HOA had filed anything, any record, any retroactive request. When I reached the clerk, a tired-looking woman named Gina, she frowned at the name. "Langford? Yeah. They've submitted a lot lately. Hold on." She tapped a few keys. "Nope. Nothing about creek modifications. Closest thing is a beautification request from last year denied." "Denied." "Yep. Said they wanted to enhance the view and improve stormwater aesthetics. We sent a letter back saying it required EPA review and landowner permission. Never heard back." My stomach dropped. "So what they're doing now is illegal." She glanced around. "Off the record, yeah." That was the first time I realized how reckless Karen really was. Not just arrogant reckless. By the time I got home, it had started to rain. Not hard, but steady. I grabbed Jasper and walked back down to the creek. They'd raised the concrete barrier another foot. There was even a new wooden walkway that crossed it like they were planning a private bridge. But the water was pushing harder now, pooling behind the wall. The current was angry. I walked the length of the buildup and noticed something new, a plastic pipe running from Karen's yard directly into the rising water. Stormwater runoff. She was channeling her gutter drains into the creek, now blocked, sending even more pressure downstream, onto my land. "Jesus, Karen," I muttered. And then I saw it my vegetable garden. Half of it already soggy. The lower edge of the field was flooded water creeping up over the fresh topsoil. I'd planted early this year. Now I'd lose half the damn crop. I grabbed my phone and started recording. March 14th. Creek flooded. HOA barrier in place. Illegal stormwater pipe from Langford residence. Garden flooding. I sent it all to Tom. An hour later, he replied, "Do not touch that barrier, but document everything. Trust me." Karen was playing a game, but I'd stopped playing games a long time ago. She didn't know it yet, but she was building her own downfall, one cement block at a time. 3 days after the rain started, I opened my mailbox to find another envelope from the HOA. Heavy glossy paper. Their crest stamped in gold. I already knew it would be trouble before I even slid it open. Inside were 3 pages. Page 1 was a formal notice of violation, citing me for excessive water runoff affecting neighboring properties. Page 2 demanded I cease and desist all interference with approved HOA infrastructure improvements. And page 3, a proposed fine, $1,200, payable within 10 business days to avoid further legal escalation. I stared at the pages in silence for a long minute. The language wasn't just bureaucratic, it was manipulative. They weren't citing actual laws. They were twisting homeowner policies written for subdivision hedges and trash bins, trying to apply them to a working farm that had stood for nearly a century before Silverwood Estates even existed. They were gaslighting me, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the slow burn of fury settle low in my chest. I called Tom again. He picked up on the second ring. "They're trying to flip the narrative," I said, pacing the porch. "They're claiming I'm the one flooding them." "Let me guess," Tom replied dryly. "No actual code violation cited, just vague community guidelines language." "Exactly," he sighed. "Classic HOA move. They're hoping to confuse you, maybe scare you into compliance. They use that tactic all the time against homeowners who don't understand the difference between HOA rules and actual municipal law." "Well, I'm not most homeowners." "No, you're not," he agreed. "Send me everything. I'll prepare a formal response. And Ray, document everything you can. Photos, videos, measurements, dates, witnesses, if you've got any. The more the better." I hung up and walked the fence line. The water had finally receded after 2 days of solid rain, but the damage was done. A third of my early crop was ruined. My lower pasture, the one closest to the creek, had turned into a soggy marsh. Jasper limped around the edge of it, whining softly. He hated the mud. That afternoon, I spent 4 hours photographing every inch of the damage, the backed-up creek, the eroded embankments, the standing water in my rows of kale and carrots. I measured water depth with a metal stake. I mapped the flow with little surveyor flags. I even flew my old drone over Karen's backyard to capture aerial shots of the concrete barrier and that illegal pipe spewing runoff. The next morning, I hand-delivered a packet to the county environmental office. They gave me a thin smile and said they'd look into it, but I could see it in their eyes. They'd been here before. HOA complaints and counter-complaints filled their inboxes year-round. It wasn't going to be enough. Not yet. That weekend, Karen had a party. No joke. I watched from my porch as a dozen SUVs pulled into her driveway, unloading yoga moms and cocktail dads. She strung fairy lights across the hedges and set up a DJ under a white canopy. The music thumped into the night, some bass-heavy pop that rattled my windows. And I noticed something else too. She'd placed tiki torches right along the creek barrier, lighting up her new private water feature, like it was some kind of trophy, as if the creek was hers now. The next morning, I found plastic cups and party napkins strewn across my side of the water. Jasper sniffed at a soggy wedge of lemon someone had tossed near the pasture. I knelt down and stared at the way the water was barely moving. It wasn't a creek anymore. It was a stagnant trench, and it was dying. That week, Tom sent back a formal cease and desist letter with attachments of the Georgia Riparian Rights Act EPA guidelines for water flow obstruction and a breakdown of municipal permitting violations. We mailed it, emailed it, and had a copy posted publicly at the HOA office gate. Karen didn't respond directly. Instead, 2 days later, I received another HOA letter, this one even bolder. Due to repeated noncompliance and harassment of HOA contractors, the board is evaluating additional legal options, including but not limited to formal trespass claims and civil penalties. Harassment. I hadn't so much as raised my voice to those contractors. But the implication was clear. They wanted to wear me down, not just financially, but emotionally. They were trying to turn me into the villain, the angry farmer, the unreasonable old man. Just another story to laugh about at their next HOA mixer. That night, I called my daughter Cassidy. She's in her late 20s now, living in Atlanta, working in environmental policy. Smart as hell. Way smarter than I was at her age. I hadn't wanted to drag her into all this, but the line had been crossed. I told her everything. From the moment I saw the first cinder block to the latest round of letters. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, if they're violating riparian flow, there might be federal implications, especially if it's affecting agriculture. I've seen state attorneys get involved over less. You think it's worth pushing? I think you're not just fighting for your farm," she said. "You're fighting for the idea that landowners still have rights in this country." She promised to connect me with a colleague who handled cases like mine. And that night, I sat in the dark listening to the creek struggle to breathe behind concrete and pipe and ego. But something in me felt steadier than before. They wanted to play games with letters. Fine. I could write letters too. But soon I'd be speaking in a language they couldn't ignore. It started with a soft squelch under my boot. I was walking the east edge of the lower field, with Jasper checking on the drip irrigation lines I'd installed last spring, when I stepped into what looked like solid ground and sank halfway to my ankle. The soil slurped around the leather and tried to hold on when I pulled free. It wasn't just rainwater anymore. It was seepage, heavy, silty, and rising. The rows of green that had pushed up just 2 weeks earlier, mustard greens, spring onions, snap peas, were now wilting at the roots. I knelt down and felt the stems, soft, saturated, dying from underneath. I followed the wet trail back, my eyes scanning the contour of the land. The water wasn't draining the way it should. Normally, the creek would have carried off the excess, fed it downstream. But the barrier Karen built had changed the whole ecosystem. It wasn't just holding water back, it was pushing it sideways. And that sideways pressure was now invading my farm. Later that morning, I set up a GoPro on a tripod facing the worst part of the field. I wanted a time-lapse of the water rising inch by inch. I wanted proof. Because somewhere in the back of my mind, I'd begun to understand what this was becoming. Not a disagreement, not a dispute, a record. I started documenting everything. At noon, I drove into town to rent a soil saturation meter. The clerk at the hardware store raised an eyebrow when I said I was using it on farmland near a creek. "You got flooding issues," something like that. I didn't explain. I spent the next 2 days logging readings. By Sunday night, the eastern quadrant of the lower field had water levels high enough to classify it as a seasonal wetland, which was ridiculous. That patch of land had grown tomatoes for 70 years. I emailed Tom the readings, Cassidy too. She called me after midnight. "They're not just changing the flow, Dad. They're redirecting stormwater from the entire subdivision onto your land. That's a major violation of the Clean Water Act. If we can prove that this becomes bigger than just HOA drama, it becomes federal. Will federal care about one old man's soggy onions?" She was quiet for a moment. "They'll care about runoff contamination, agricultural impact, and unpermitted hydrologic modification. That's the language they listen to." And that's when something shifted inside me. For weeks, I'd been playing defense, reacting to the HOA's moves, trying to protect what I could. But now I saw the shape of the fight ahead. It wasn't just about water, it was about power. And I knew how to fight that kind of war. The next morning, I drove to the edge of Karen's property. I had no intention of stepping onto her land, but I wanted one clear look. She was standing on her deck, coffee mug in hand, her tiny dog yapping beside her. She saw me, smiled. I didn't. Instead, I pointed to the swollen field behind me. The water glittered in the morning sun like a warning flare. Her smile faded. I walked back to my truck and made 3 calls. First to Tom to begin drafting an environmental injunction. Second to Cassidy's contact at the State Water Board to request a site visit. And third, to my neighbor down the ridge, Cal Bennett. He ran cattle and had lived 2 properties south of mine for 40 years. We'd fixed fences together, fought off a mountain lion once, and drank more than a few beers under open skies. "Cal," I said, "how's your lower pasture holding up?" There was a long pause, then flooded, and I mean bad. Lost 2 calves to the muck. "Have you looked upstream lately?" He didn't say anything for a beat, Then you're telling me this is HOA crap. I'm telling you, they built a dam across Sutter's Creek. A silence, then a sharp inhale. I'll come by tonight. That night, over 2 beers and a mud-stained satellite map, Cal saw the same thing I did. The barrier on Karen's side was choking the flow. Her backyard was perched on a gentle slope, and with the runoff pipe she'd added, she'd effectively rerouted the entire drainage burden of Silverwood Estates downhill onto us. That's not just stupid, Cal said. That's criminal. I nodded. We agreed to co-file a joint complaint with the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. 2 days later, I saw Karen at the community grocery store. She was by the organic hummus, dressed in tennis whites, talking on her phone loud enough for the entire aisle to hear. He's exaggerating everything. It's not even real flooding. Probably just poor drainage. I mean, how hard is it to manage a few rows of lettuce? She spotted me, didn't flinch. I didn't either. Instead, I walked past her cart slow and steady and said loud enough for her Bluetooth earpiece and her ego to hear. You ever think maybe the land's just getting ready to take back what's hers? She blinked like I'd spoken a language she didn't understand. That night it rained again, harder this time, sheets of it. I stood by the window and watched the runoff pour off her roof through the illegal pipe and into the waterlogged soil that had once been my spring harvest. But I wasn't just watching anymore. I was gathering, preparing, and the land, old and wise and angry, was doing the same. I've dealt with government bureaucracy before. 22 years in the Army taught me that when you walk into a building with a seal over the door, you're either going to get help or you're going to get handled. I had no intention of being handled. The morning after the 4th storm, in 2 weeks, I drove to Belridge City Hall. I'd shaved, put on my old dress boots, the ones I wore to my daughter's graduation, and carried a folder thick with photos, timestamps, topographical maps, drone shots, and signed affidavits from both myself and Cal Bennett. Cassidy had helped me put it all together. She even printed out email threads between the HOA and the county clerk's office showing prior denial of the creek beautification request. The goal wasn't to make noise. It was to show them we were beyond noise now. Inside the reception area smelled like old paper and burnt coffee. The clerk at the front desk, her name tag said Marcia, barely looked up when I approached. I need to speak to someone in the planning and development office, I said. Do you have an appointment? No. But I've got a flooding creek poisoned soil and a subdivision that's rerouted stormwater onto my land without a permit. That made her blink. She set her coffee down. I'll see who's available. 15 minutes later, a man named Kevin Bishop walked out. Mid-30s khakis blue shirt tucked too tightly into his waistband and a badge that said Senior Analyst. He shook my hand like he was doing me a favor and led me to a cramped meeting room with one window and a flickering light. I hear you've got a concern about Silverwood Estates, he said, already glancing down at his tablet. I've got more than a concern, I said, sliding the folder across the table. What they've done to the creek on my property is illegal. He opened the folder, flipped through the first few pages, then closed it like it was a restaurant menu. Mr. Matheson, I understand this situation is frustrating, but the HOA has standing as a registered private entity, as long as they stay within their charter. They're not, I cut in. That's what this proves. He hesitated. The barrier they've built has no permit. The stormwater pipe they installed was never reviewed by the city. The runoff is flooding multiple properties, and under Georgia state law, they're violating riparian water rights. I leaned forward. You don't have to take my word for it. I've got confirmation from a private land rights attorney, a state policy consultant, and 2 farmers with over 40 years of history on that creek. Do you really want to be the guy who ignored all that? Kevin's jaw tightened, but he nodded. I'll escalate this to legal review. That was something, at least. I shook his hand again more firmly this time, and left the building with a strange feeling in my chest. Not satisfaction. Not yet. But a flicker of momentum. By the time I got home, though, it had already begun to fade. Waiting in my mailbox was yet another letter from the HOA. This one printed on thicker stock, the kind they probably reserved for weddings or war. Inside was a formal notice of hearing. The HOA board had scheduled a disciplinary session to address my non-compliant conduct, refusal to cooperate with improvement projects, and slanderous accusations directed at HOA leadership. Slander. They were trying to flip the narrative again. But I was ready this time. That weekend, Cassidy drove in from Atlanta. She pulled into the gravel driveway with her compact hybrid and stepped out in boots that didn't quite match the mud, but with a fire in her eyes I hadn't seen since she was a teenager protesting a chemical plant being built near her school. "Dad," she said, hugging me, "let's burn this thing down. Legally, I mean." We spent the evening reviewing everything. She flagged inconsistencies in the HOA charter, specifically the sections Karen had been citing in her letters. Turns out their supposed shared easement clause only applied to common community spaces, like playgrounds or clubhouses, not natural waterways on private property. They'd been bluffing. And worse for them, they'd been bluffing in writing. Cassidy helped me draft a formal complaint addressed not just to the HOA, but to the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, the local EPA office, and the County Water Commission. We included every document, photo, and statement we had. By Monday morning, the packet was over 80 pages. Tom called later that day. "You're doing everything right," he said. "Just be prepared. These people won't back down easily. They'll make noise. They'll dig in." "I'm used to that," I said. "I've been through war. And this one's going to test you the same way, wear you down bit by bit." But something had shifted. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was building something. Brick by brick, document by document. 2 days before the HOA hearing, I got a call from Kevin Bishop again. His tone was different now, strained. "Mr. Matheson, the city is opening a review into the HOA's actions at Silverwood Estates. In the meantime, we're issuing a stop work order on any further modifications to the creek until the investigation concludes." I almost dropped the phone. "Thank you," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. "That's a start." Karen's cement wall wasn't coming down yet, but at least for now it wouldn't grow any taller. That evening, the air felt a little lighter. The creek, still choked, still struggling, ran a little clearer. And I stood at its edge, Jasper by my side, watching the last of the twilight settle on the water like a promise. This isn't over, not yet, but the tide is turning. It started with a sky the color of old pewter. That morning, I woke up to the hush that only comes before a big storm. No birdsong, no wind, just a strange stillness that settled deep into your bones like a warning. Jasper felt it too. He stood at the screen door, tail low, ears twitching, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he could smell something I couldn't. The radar on my phone confirmed that a major weather system was moving in from the northwest. Cassidy had already headed back to Atlanta, promising to keep pushing things on the legal side. Cal called around 9 and said he was hauling his cattle to higher ground just in case. We both remembered the storm from '09 that knocked out half the county's back roads. This one looked bigger. I made my rounds, secured the chicken coop, checked the barn roof, moved tools off the ground. I should have felt nervous, but I didn't. I felt prepared, focused, the way I used to feel before deployment. You don't control the storm, but you control your readiness. It started raining just after noon. Not a drizzle, a downpour. Thick and fast, like God had kicked a barrel of nails over the clouds. Within an hour, the gutters overflowed and the ditches turned into mini rivers. By 2 p.m., I could see it. The creek had breached the concrete wall. Karen's barrier, the same one she poured and polished like it was part of some modern art installation, was beginning to tremble. Water pushed against it with terrifying force, piling high on my side, searching for any weakness. I grabbed my binoculars and trained them across the hedgerow. Her backyard was already flooded. The decorative garden she'd installed last summer. Drowned. The row of stepping stones she'd laid beside the fire pit, submerged. The fake turf lounge area, floating in chunks like a half-eaten cake. And right there, half parked over her rear patio and angled downhill. Her white Lexus SUV. I watched as the water crept toward it inch by inch, licking the tires, swirling around the undercarriage. The HOA's crew hadn't been back since the stop work order, and now the storm was doing what logic letters and legal filings had failed to accomplish. Nature was answering. By late afternoon, the rain turned violent. I stood beneath the covered porch, boots soaked, Jasper shaking beside me, as lightning cracked over the hills and thunder rolled like cannon fire. Wind screamed through the trees, tossing branches into the yard, but my eyes never left the creek. It was no longer a creek. It was a flood channel, a snarling black serpent carving a new path through everything in its way. And then it happened. The concrete wall groaned. I heard it over the wind, a low sickening crack, like a rib snapping under pressure. I ran to the fence and stared as a chunk of the barrier tore loose and vanished beneath the water. The whole structure tilted, collapsed. A sudden violent burst of current exploded downstream, sweeping through Karen's lawn like judgment. And the SUV, heavy as it was, didn't stand a chance. The force of the water lifted the front wheels. It turned slowly, awkwardly, like it was resisting. And then, with a lurch that made my stomach flip, the entire vehicle slid sideways, tires skimming the slick grass, and crashed into her privacy fence with a metallic screech. Karen was there. She burst out of her back door in a neon rain poncho, barefoot, screaming something I couldn't hear through the roar. She splashed through the rising flood, hands flailing as if she could physically push the water back. But the SUV was already halfway down the slope, spinning gently bumper first toward the culvert. And then it was gone. The last thing I saw was her hands clawing toward the sky as the white Lexus disappeared into the swollen creek channel and vanished under a bridge 2 lots down. I stood frozen, heart hammering, as Jasper growled low beside me. I didn't feel joy, not exactly. It was something deeper, a grim validation. Like watching justice write itself in real time, scripted not by courts or signatures, but by consequence. 20 minutes later, emergency vehicles arrived, 1 fire truck, a sheriff's cruiser, and a flood response unit from the county. I stayed on my porch watching from a distance, drinking black coffee I'd forgotten was cold. They pulled the SUV from a drainage ditch a mile away. Karen's screams could be heard clear across the flooded pasture. By nightfall, the storm eased. The wind died down. The clouds began to part just enough to let moonlight shimmer on the flooded fields. The air smelled of wet earth, diesel, and washed away lies. I walked down to the creek with a flashlight. The wall was gone. Completely obliterated. In its place, the water ran fast but clean, like a river finally unchained. Tree roots jutted from the eroded bank. Mangled pieces of concrete lay like broken teeth scattered along the path. I knelt by the water. For the first time in months, it was moving freely. And in that sound, the gurgling, rushing hum of wild water reclaiming its course, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Peace. Not victory, not yet, but peace. Back at the house, I called Tom. She lost the SUV, I said simply. There was a pause. Damn, he replied, you get video. I got everything. Well, he said we just moved from defense to prosecution. The morning after the flood was quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful, just stunned. Sunlight glared off standing water, casting reflections that danced like broken mirrors across driveways and lawns. Silverwood Estates had always been proud of its manicured symmetry hedges, trimmed to perfect squares, mailboxes, identical American flags waving in the same measured rhythm. But that morning, the HOA's kingdom looked shell-shocked. Mud streaked the sidewalks. Lawn chairs lay overturned in gutters. Garbage bins floated on their sides like little dead ships. And right in the middle of it all, half stranded at the end of Langford Drive, was Karen. Standing beside the wreckage of her beloved white Lexus, now caked in creek slime and trailing clumps of grass from its shattered grille. She was screaming at someone on her phone. Loud, animated. No Bluetooth this time, just raw, panicked, yelling, her voice hoarse and cracking like she hadn't stopped since the night before. I wasn't close enough to hear her exact words, but I didn't need to. The entire neighborhood was watching. From behind curtains, over hedges, peeking through cracked windows, people were listening. They'd seen the fire truck lights, the tow truck, the muddy SUV. They knew something had gone wrong. But for the first time, they weren't blaming me. They were looking at her. And I'll tell you, there was something electric about that shift. Subtle, but powerful. Because for weeks, Karen had spun the narrative painting me as the obstinate farmer, the unreasonable old man who hated progress. She'd hosted HOA brunches on that very patio, sipping mimosas, while telling her friends about my tantrums over the creek. Now she stood ankle-deep in her own flooded driveway, with nothing left to spin. I stepped out that morning in clean boots and a pressed flannel shirt, not because I wanted to gloat, but because I knew the moment had come. Let them see me. Let them see the man they'd heard so much about, not shouting, not raving, just calm, watchful, and right. I walked Jasper slowly past the Langford house. Karen froze when she saw me. Her face flushed, eyes, red hair wild. She looked like someone who'd slept on panic and woken up in consequence. She opened her mouth, probably to accuse, to deflect, but nothing came out. Just breath. Shallow and sharp. I tipped my hat. She turned away. A moment later, her husband, Tom Langford, The silent type who always nodded but never looked me in the eye stepped out the door. He stood beside her surveying the wreckage. Then he did something that genuinely surprised me. He nodded at me once, slow, eyes steady, like maybe just maybe he knew. I returned the nod. Later that day, I got a call from the county inspector assigned to the creek case. Her name was Dana Mallory, tough, efficient, and sharp as a tack. Cassidy had looped her in after the third complaint filing, and now finally she had boots on the ground. "I've reviewed the footage," she said. "Between the drone captures, the drainage patterns, and the collapse video, I think we have enough for an enforcement action, civil or criminal." "Both," she said. I exhaled slowly. "And the HOA? We're contacting their board this afternoon. Based on what I'm seeing, they're liable for unauthorized alterations of a protected waterway endangerment through misdirected runoff and probable insurance fraud if they filed repairs under natural disaster without disclosing their role." I didn't say anything, just let her words wash over me. "And Mr. Matheson?" "Yes. Thank you for documenting everything. You did this the right way." I hung up and stared out over the pasture. The land was still bruised, deep gouges in the soil, standing water in pockets, but the worst was over. The water, finally unblocked, had begun to carve its way back to normal. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I walked down to the community board, the actual bulletin board by the clubhouse, where notices were posted. I tacked up a single page. Big bold letters at the top. Notice of County Enforcement Action. Below it, the contact info for the inspector's office, plus a few choice stills from the footage, Karen's barrier before collapse, the flooded field, and the SUV's final journey down the creek. No commentary, no threats, just facts. The next morning I heard it. Voices, raised, angry. I stepped onto my porch with coffee in hand and watched as 3 other HOA members gathered outside Karen's house. They weren't knocking politely. They were demanding explanations. "Why didn't we know about the stormwater diversion? You told us you got approval. Was that a lie?" "My fence is gone, Karen. My garage flooded." She stood in the doorway, defensive, trying to hold her ground. But her voice no longer carried authority. It cracked, buckled, collapsed under weight that wasn't water, but truth. A small crowd formed. Residents from both sides of the street, watching. And then came the best part. Someone, probably the retired guy from Lot 9, asked the question I'd been waiting weeks to hear. And did Ray try to stop this? Karen hesitated. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. And that silence, that was my vindication. That evening, I found a handwritten note taped to my mailbox. "Mr. Matheson, I owe you an apology. I didn't know what was really going on. Thank you for fighting back. You were right. Sarah McMillan, Lot 12. I folded it slowly and slid it into the folder with all the other evidence. Not because it was part of the case, but because it meant more than all the lawsuits in the world. The tide had turned, and now the current was sweeping in the other direction. There's a kind of power in truth, not the kind you shout, but the kind you build quietly, piece by piece. Like stacking bricks in a wall that no storm can knock down. After the collapse of Karen's barrier and the flood that followed, I knew one thing. The only way to finish this was to document everything. Down to the last inch of pipe drop of runoff and word of HOA spin. This wasn't just about getting justice for myself anymore. It was about ensuring that no one else in this town got steamrolled by HOA arrogance masked as authority. So I turned my house into a command center. I cleared the kitchen table, laid out every photo letter, map, time-stamped video, and weather report I'd collected over the past 2 months. Cassidy had already digitized everything into folders. Now we began organizing them like prosecutors building a case, because that's exactly what we were doing. Cassidy came up from Atlanta every weekend now. She'd bring her laptop, a portable scanner, and the kind of laser-focused energy I hadn't seen in her since she led a student lawsuit against a plastics factory near her campus. They're not just guilty, she kept saying, they're documentably guilty. I liked the sound of that. By midweek, we'd created a 3-part portfolio. Section 1, Physical Evidence. Photos and drone footage of the concrete barrier before, during, and after the collapse. Flood damage to my fields and Cal's pasture. Time-stamped soil saturation logs. Drone flyovers showing the stormwater pipe entering the creek. GoPro time-lapses of rising water. Section 2, Legal Irregularities. scanned copies of the HOA's letters, internal contradictions in their policies, emails from the county denying their permit requests, and a copy of the HOA charter Cassidy had annotated with a highlighter like a surgeon marking an incision. Section 3 witness statements. Mine Cal's the retired guy from Lot 9, who'd seen the crew installing the pipe, and even a landscaper who anonymously confirmed Karen had ordered the modifications without waiting for official go-ahead. We backed up everything 2 hard drives, 2 encrypted clouds. Cassidy even set up a folder labeled, "In case of retaliation," because by now we knew what HOA retaliation looked like. Sure enough, it came. The following Monday, I received a letter not from the HOA, but from Karen's personal attorney. It was a cease and desist accusing me of defamation, public shaming, and malicious surveillance. They demanded I remove the flood footage from any public or private platforms and threatened a civil suit if I continued my harassment campaign. I read it once. Then I laughed, a sharp, dry sound that echoed through the kitchen like a shot fired into silence. Cassidy looked up from her laptop. "They're bluffing," she said without even needing to read the letter. "They're panicking." Tom confirmed it 2 hours later. "They have no case," he said flatly. "In fact, this actually helps you. It shows that Karen is acting unilaterally, not as the HOA, but as a private individual trying to silence legal criticism." He filed our own notice in return, a formal claim for damages. I wasn't after money, but I wasn't going to let her slide either. Not after everything she'd done. Not after watching my field rot, my neighbors lose livestock, and the land suffer because of one woman's vanity. Meanwhile, the County Water Commission released their official report. It stated plainly that the HOA had failed to acquire the necessary permits, that the alteration of the creek violated state environmental codes, and that the stormwater redirection constituted an illegal modification of a protected watercourse. It was everything we needed. But I didn't stop, because the truth needed to live beyond a folder on my desktop. I reached out to a local journalist, Melissa Tran. She ran a weekly investigative column in the Belridge Times called The Undercurrent. I sent her the timeline, the evidence, and every document we had. She called me the next morning almost breathless. "Ray," she said, "this isn't just a dispute, this is a scandal." She published the story 2 days later. The headline read, "HOA Floodgate When Beautification Becomes Destruction." She didn't mince words. She named Karen Langford, quoted the county report, and even included still frames of her Lexus sinking into the creek. It wasn't cruel. It was factual. But the damage to Karen's reputation, irreversible. By the weekend, HOA members were calling for an emergency meeting. Rumors flew. Karen had resigned. Karen was being investigated by the state bar. Karen had fled town. None of them were entirely true. But what was true was that she was finished, at least as far as Silverwood Estates was concerned. I walked into that HOA meeting, not as a defendant, not as a pariah, but as the one man in the room who'd stood his ground and had the proof to back it up. They offered a settlement. I refused. Instead, I requested 3 things. 1, the creek to be restored, fully under county supervision. 2, the HOA charter to be revised, limiting future alterations to shared or adjacent land without written consent from all affected property owners. 3, a public letter of apology from the HOA board acknowledging their mishandling and misrepresentation of events. To my surprise, they agreed. It wasn't because they wanted to. It was because I'd left them no choice. That night, I walked down to the creek again. The water was lower now, flowing fast and clean. Cal's cows were back in the pasture. The air smelled like spring again, mudgrass, and recovery. I knelt by the water's edge, Jasper beside me. "Got it all down, didn't we, boy?" He wagged his tail. I'd built a wall of truth, and for once, it had held. The courthouse in Belridge isn't grand. It's a squat red brick building tucked between a post office and an overgrown lot where kids used to ride bikes. No marble columns, no sweeping staircase. But it had something more important: jurisdiction. And as I walked through its doors that Monday morning, I didn't feel fear. I felt ready. Cassidy was beside me, laptop in hand, her eyes scanning the notes she'd color-coded over the weekend. Tom met us at the top of the courthouse steps, briefcase in one hand, coffee in the other. "You nervous?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not after what I've seen." Inside the room was modest 2 long rows of wooden benches, a single judge's bench at the front, and a creaky ceiling fan that hummed like it was trying to stay awake. On the opposite side of the aisle, Karen Langford sat with her attorney. She looked smaller. Maybe it was the lighting, maybe it was the weight of consequence. But the woman who once strutted through HOA meetings like a queen now looked like someone waiting to be sentenced, tight-lipped, hair pulled back too tight, a brittle expression like cracked porcelain. The judge, Dana Hughes, was the kind you didn't try to impress. No nonsense. Former environmental lawyer. She opened the docket and looked up with eyes that had already seen enough. Let's begin. Tom started with a quiet confidence that filled the room. He laid out the timeline: Karen's installation of the barrier without permits, the HOA's refusal to heed cease and desist notices, the redirected stormwater, the flood damage, the retaliatory letters, and finally, the collapse. He handed the judge a thick binder of exhibits, every photo, timestamp, and legal document, a full ecosystem of evidence. Karen's attorney, someone new, stiff and overly polite, tried to argue that the HOA had acted within a reasonable interpretation of its charter, and that Karen had only sought to improve safety and aesthetics for the community. Judge Hughes raised one eyebrow. "Do you have permits to support that interpretation?" He fumbled. "Well, we believed the easement." "Belief and law," she interrupted, "are not the same. Show me the permit." He didn't have one. Then it was Cassidy's turn. She wasn't even an attorney, but with the judge's permission, she read a prepared statement as the affected party's daughter and environmental specialist. Her voice was steady, clear, and devastating. She outlined the ecological impact of obstructing natural waterways. She described how altering riparian flow could damage topsoil, drown crops, and collapse entire drainage systems in flood zones like ours. And then she presented the video. The courtroom lights dimmed as the monitor flickered on. There it was. Karen's barrier, proud and illegal. The water rising, the collapse, and the SUV drifting like a bloated corpse into the current. No narration, just time-stamped silence. It ended with the county report stamped with the words, "Unauthorized modification, enforcement recommended." When the lights came back on, no one spoke. Even Karen didn't look up. Then it was my turn. I stood slowly. My knees still ached from the years, but my voice did not waver. "I've lived on that land all my life," I began. "My grandfather built the first fence that touches that creek. My father taught me to listen to the land when it's angry, and I've never seen it angrier than the day it tore through that wall. I told the court what it felt like to watch my fields drown, to watch my neighbors suffer, to be accused of causing the very flood I tried to prevent. I didn't come here today to punish," I said. "I came here to protect." I looked toward Karen, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. I tried to do this the right way. Letters, warnings, evidence. They ignored me, laughed, called me difficult, until the water did what I wasn't allowed to. I sat down, breath heavy in my chest. The courtroom remained still. Judge Hughes leaned forward, hands clasped. "Ms. Langford," she said, "you may not have physically poured the concrete, but you directed it, permitted it, and dismissed valid concerns from your neighbor and your own city. That is negligence. The HOA, under your leadership, created conditions that resulted in real damage, both personal and environmental." She glanced at Karen's attorney. "I will be referring this matter for civil penalties and potential environmental violation review at the state level." Karen flinched. Judge Hughes turned back to us. "Mr. Matheson, you are awarded full damages for crop loss and property restoration. The HOA will bear the cost. Further, I am authorizing a monitored restoration of the affected creek path under supervision of the County Water Commission." I closed my eyes, just for a second. It wasn't joy. It was release. Later, outside the courthouse, Cassidy hugged me tight. "You did it, Dad." "We did it," I corrected. "You, me, Tom, the land." Reporters had gathered outside. Melissa Tran was there scribbling notes. Karen exited the courthouse, last flanked by her attorney. No sunglasses this time. Just eyes full of something heavier than shame. Consequence. She didn't scream, she didn't look back. And I didn't need her to. I wasn't interested in her humiliation. I was interested in something bigger. The truth stood. And it had finally fully legally been heard. It took nearly 2 months for the county restoration team to fully dismantle the remnants of Karen's barrier and rehabilitate the creek bed. During that time, my farm went quiet. No tractors hummed. No seeds were sown. I let the land breathe, rest, heal. Some mornings, I'd walk down with Jasper, both of us ankle-deep in spring mist, and sit on the same boulder I used to when I was a boy. I'd watch the water run again, free and fast, cutting its natural path with a kind of purpose I envied. No detours, no obstruction, just the raw force of nature correcting what had been made wrong. The scars were still there, of course. A portion of my field remained bare, stripped of its crops, and littered with debris from the flood. The barn siding still bore the watermark from where the creek had surged too close. Even the fence down by the south edge hadn't yet been put back up. But the creek, she was alive again. And something about that felt like a vow. In early June, I received a letter not from the HOA, not from Karen's lawyer, but from the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. It read, "Due to your thorough documentation and willingness to work cooperatively with state and county agencies, your case is being cited in a new pilot program for community water rights education and HOA accountability standards. They asked if I'd be willing to let them use drone footage of the flood photos of the restoration and parts of Cassidy's presentation for statewide training. I didn't hesitate. Yes, I wrote, use all of it. That afternoon, I walked back down to the creek with a spade in one hand and a handful of wildflower seeds in the other. I scattered them along the bank, blew Flax Black-Eyed Susan some bee balm. Nothing fancy. Just a little color to remind me that from ruin comes something worth growing. I didn't need revenge. I needed rebirth. By midsummer, the farm was thriving again. I'd replanted the lower field with a hardy cover crop barley this time, and it came up quick. The cattle were back to grazing on the other side of the creek. Even the frogs returned croaking loudly on warm nights, as if they'd never left. Cassidy visited every other weekend. She'd set up a small desk in the guest bedroom, and sometimes stayed long enough to work remotely for a day or two. Watching her walk the fields in her sneakers, squinting at soil charts and EPA reports, filled me with a kind of quiet pride I hadn't known I was missing. "You're building more than a case now," I told her once. "You're building something better." She smiled. "So are you." The HOA, for its part, went silent. Karen resigned. No public statements. No farewell email. One day, she was gone. Word had it she sold the house at a loss and moved north. A new family bought the place, young couple, with a toddler and a dog who barked back at Jasper with more friendliness than threat. They stopped by to introduce themselves, holding lemonade and banana bread. When I told them about the creek, they listened. When I explained its history, how it had once been blocked and nearly broken, they promised unprompted never to touch it. I believed them. One evening near the end of July, I stood out by the mailbox, the sun low behind me, casting long shadows across the dirt road. An older man I didn't recognize slowed his truck as he passed, rolled down the window and called out, "You're the farmer who stood up to the HOA, right?" I nodded cautiously. He smiled. "Good on you." And just like that, he drove on. It was a simple thing, but it stuck with me. Because for months, I had felt like a man alone, fighting cement and silence, and bureaucracy, with nothing but a shovel and a folder of photos. But now people knew. And they cared. The story had traveled further than I'd ever imagined. Not because I wanted fame, but because the land deserves defenders. That night, as stars blinked awake over the pasture, and Jasper settled at my feet, I opened the windows of the farmhouse and let the sound of the creek drift in. It whispered not loud but clear. It was a sound of returning, of rightness. And in that rhythm I heard something I hadn't heard in a long time. Peace. Not because things went back to the way they were, but because I fought for what mattered. And this time the land won. So did I. So did we all.